Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, True Scary Stories. Where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it in your country? Have you shared my channel with your friends yet, or are you keeping these whispers all to yourself? You know, the kind of whispers that stick to the back of your throat, the kind you save for those nights when the house settles and the shadows seem just a little too deep. We're leaning into that tonight, aren't we? You're tucked in, or maybe you're scrolling in the eerie glow of your device, and outside you can probably hear the wind doing its low, unsettling sigh, or perhaps the rain is tapping out some kind of syncopated rhythm on your window pane. It sounds suspiciously like tiny, desperate fingers trying to get in. Just so you know, listening to a 4-hour deep dive into an insoluble maritime mystery while alone in a dark room usually correlates with a 98% chance of needing to sleep with a nightlight. I'm just here to enhance your experience or ruin your sleep, depending on how you look at it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're new, tell me your location and local time in the comments. I always like to see how far these strange, somber stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that low, unsettling hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are settling in now, the ambient sounds of your room beginning to blend with the low drone of my voice. And we're going to begin with the rhythm of the waves, not the gentle, lulling sound of a cruise ship wake, but the unsettling, metallic clang of an empty schooner rocking slowly on a restless sea. We're focusing on the year 1921, a time just before the world decided everything needed to be tracked, logged, and solved, which, honestly, makes the unsolved mysteries all the more satisfyingly horrifying. Our vessel is the Carol A. Deering, a sturdy 5-masted schooner built for the heavy haul of coal. It's a gorgeous thing in its prime, but its legacy is one of chilling, absolute silence. You see it floating there in the vast, indifferent expanse of the Atlantic, and you understand instantly that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong. Imagine the chill that runs up the spine of the United States Coast Guard patrolman Cale as he spots it on January 31, 1921. It's sitting stubbornly on the treacherous shoals known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic, just off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. Diamond Shoals, they call it, a place that actively seeks to claim ships. This one, however, seems to have delivered itself perfectly intact, like a ghastly gift. The initial report is sparse but telling. The Deering is stuck fast on the outer bars. The sails are partially set, but she's running aground. She's completely abandoned. No people, no distress signal, nothing. Just a ship, a beautifully constructed wooden shell stripped of its human component. This is the seed of horror that we're planting tonight. The realization that sometimes the most frightening thing isn't the presence of a monster, but the absolute, inexplicable absence of everyone who should be there. Think about the famous mainstream scary facts surrounding maritime abandonment. It's hard to talk about this without mentioning the Flying Dutchman, of course, but let's go with something closer to the Deering's geography and epic, the tale of the Mary Celeste. She's the most famous ghost ship of all, discovered in 1872, sailing perfectly well near the Azores without a single soul aboard, the crew seemingly having vanished into thin air, leaving behind food on the table and full cargo. Tale, much like the one we are embarking on, settles into the cultural consciousness because it defies the fundamental rule of the ocean. If you leave a ship, it's usually because it's sinking, burning, or broken. The Mary Celeste and later the Deering weren't any of those things. They were simply empty. You can almost hear the questions starting to bubble in the minds of the early investigators. Where did they go? Why didn't they take anything? You're asking those questions too, aren't you? You're wondering if you would have been the one person who managed to send a single cryptic SOS before whatever happened. Now, for a darkly humorous pause, consider this. I asked a ghost ship captain what his favorite part of a joke was. He said, the punchline, because then I can stop listening. See, even the permanently lost prefer a quick exit. The Deering had set off from Rio de Janeiro, bound for Portland, Maine, carrying a load of coal, a solid, stable cargo. The voyage, until its final spectral appearance, was entirely ordinary. And yet, there it sits, listing slightly, the only sound the persistent slap of the sea against its hull. This is where the scholarly debate phrasing comes in handy. Researchers disagree on whether the perfect state of the Deering's cargo and structure suggests a controlled evacuation due to an imminent threat, or if the lack of distress signals points to a highly localized, instantaneous event that simply swept the crew away. It's the difference between a deliberate retreat and a total vacuum. And while you're grappling with that, let's introduce an obscure or fringe horror tidbit related to this watery doom. Sailors, particularly in that era, harbored a genuine deep-seated fear of what they called sea dregs. It wasn't an actual monster, but a term for the residual psychic horror left behind by all the drowned and lost at sea. The dregs, they believed, could collect into a kind of concentrated despair. an emotional undertow that would lure sailors overboard, or simply convince them that staying on the ship was far worse than the cold embrace of the water. The idea is that the Deering crew wasn't taken by a creature, but by a contagious hopelessness, a spiritual poison from the water itself. You look closer at the imagined scene, the way the light catches the wet wood. It reminds you of another joke. Why don't zombies eat comedians? Because they taste funny. Maybe the Deering's crew was just tired of the sea's long, slow punchline. The last confirmed sighting of the Deering was on January 29th, 2 days before its discovery, near the Frying Pan Shoals lightship. Captain W.B. Worley, the captain of the lightship, noted that the Deering was sailing north, its crew acting strangely, shouting that they had lost their anchors. A tall, thin man who was not the captain, Captain Wormel was known to be heavier set, relayed the message. This tiny detail is the first crack in the otherwise perfect picture of normalcy. An unauthorized man delivering a crucial message about lost equipment, a small, almost insignificant detail that, in retrospect, screams of a profound disruption already taking place on board. You're starting to realize that the sea doesn't like loose ends. It prefers smooth, perfect vanishings, and the Deering is proving to be a perfect exhibit of that preference. You try to reconcile the sturdy, beautiful design of the five-masted coal schooner with the image of it now, a derelict, a monument to an unknown event. It's like finding a meticulously wrapped Christmas present, only to open it and find nothing but sand and a faint echo. The sheer scale of the ship makes the emptiness worse. 5 masts, acres of deck, countless ropes and sails, all designed to carry the weight of a busy, living crew. Now, it only carries the weight of a secret. A huge, heavy secret, resting there on the shifting sands of the deadliest coastline in America. You feel the pull of that empty deck, a silent invitation to step aboard and become the next person to simply not be there. And finally, another morbid piece of wit, just to lighten the mood or darken it, depending on your sensibilities. What's a ghost's favorite dessert? I scream. It's getting late, and the jokes aren't getting any better, which is usually a sign that the story is getting exactly where it needs to be, right inside your head. We're moving now from the initial discovery to the details of its final eerie trajectory. You let the image of the stranded schooner settle in the quiet corners of your mind, the rhythmic tap-tap of the rain outside now sounding less like fingers and more like the ship's hull gently, persistently knocking against the sandbar. You're now tracking the Deering's journey backward, tracing the invisible line she sailed from Rio back to the treacherous coast of North Carolina. The trip began with a change of captain, a seemingly innocuous event that, in retrospect, feels like a dark omen. Captain W.B. Wormel, an older, experienced mariner, took command after the initial captain was taken ill. Wormel was known for his rigorous discipline and his methodical nature. He was not the kind of man to leave a ship or allow his ship to be left for anything less than catastrophe. And yet, catastrophe, or something far stranger, is precisely what you are now seeing in your mind's eye. You visualize the Deering sailing into the North Carolina fog, that thick, cold maritime blanket that swallows light and sound, turning the immediate world into a claustrophobic cage of white. The final documented contact, besides the brief, baffling interaction at the Frying Pan Shoals lightship, occurred earlier in the Caribbean. An ordinary trip, really. They took on coal, they departed. Everything was routine, which is exactly why the end result is so maddening. The obscurity of the Deering's final moments is what gives the story its teeth. It's the unsettling banality of the lead-up. You are imagining the crew, 11 men in total, a mix of nationalities typical of a global freighter. They're eating, sleeping, performing the endless, monotonous tasks of a transatlantic journey. They're alive, present, real. And then, they are not. Think of the immense scale of the Atlantic and how easily a vessel, even one as large as the Deering, can simply be absorbed. This leads us to our mainstream scary fact, the Sargasso Sea. Though the Deering was found north of this region, the Sargasso Sea, located in the middle of the North Atlantic Gyre, has long been a source of maritime dread. It's a vast, slow-moving region of seaweed, sargassum, and calm winds, notorious in ancient and medieval lore for trapping ships in a seemingly endless, green, weedy embrace. While scientifically explained by currents and lack of wind, the folklore persists. It's a graveyard where ships can drift, crewless, for centuries, slowly being digested by the suffocating weed. The Deering wasn't trapped in seaweed, but it was caught in a different kind of natural trap. The Diamond Shoals, a place notorious for its swift currents and shifting sandbars, a place that actively tries to dismantle you. You realize the implication of the ship being found near the lightship, where the crew claimed to have lost their anchors. That's a potentially major problem, as a lack of anchors means a ship cannot reliably hold its position in a storm or heavy current. It means they were, essentially, adrift at the mercy of the sea's whims. But was that enough to make 11 men evacuate? Here's where the humor sinks in, dark and dry, like old ship's biscuits. A pirate walks into a bar with a steering wheel sticking out of his pants. The bartender asks, "Doesn't that bother you?" The pirate says, "Aye, it's driving me nuts." You can almost picture one of the Deering's crew trying to navigate the shoals with a terrible pun on his lips. The most chilling aspect of the Deering's pre-discovery phase is the unsettling silence. Radio communication was standard even then, yet there was no broadcasted distress, no maydays. This brings us to the core of the scholarly debate phrasing. Historians still argue whether the Deering's missing log and lack of radio contact suggests a mechanical or electrical failure that disabled communications, or if the silence was intentional, implying the crew was prevented from signaling for help by a third, perhaps criminal, party. It's the difference between a tragic accident and a purposeful act of terror. The ship itself seems to have been sailing on autopilot, oblivious to the fact that its human cargo had been jettisoned. And this leads us to an obscure or fringe horror tidbit, the superstition of the sea chest. It was common lore among North Atlantic sailors that if a man died at sea, his spirit would attach itself to his sea chest, especially if it contained objects of personal significance. If that chest was opened by anyone other than a family member, the restless spirit would be released, causing ill fortune, foul weather, or, in extreme cases, turning a crew against itself through paranoia and fear. Imagine the 11 chests of the Deering, all left untouched, perhaps guarding the spectral essence of their owners, silently ensuring no new crew would ever find peace on that vessel. The captain, Worley at the lightship, did report the oddity. The man speaking was not Captain Warmell, and he seemed frantic. Worley attempted to contact the district headquarters immediately to report the unusual behavior in the vessel's plight, but bad weather had damaged the lightship's radio. The one moment of potential warning was muted by the capricious sea. A cruel, cosmic joke, wouldn't you agree? You imagine being aboard that lightship, seeing the 5 masts glide past in the mist, the small, desperate figure of a man shouting across the water, only to have the sound swallowed by the fog and the opportunity to help cut short by a broken wire. Here's your second darkly humorous joke. What's the difference between a sailor and a politician? A sailor waves goodbye, a politician waves hello. But on the Deering, they didn't wave anything, they just evaporated. It's the very ordinariness of the journey coal from Rio to Portland that makes the absence of the crew so terrifying. It suggests that terror doesn't need a massive storm or a volcanic eruption. It just needs a quiet stretch of open water and a small, undetectable moment of transition from present to absent. You find yourself listening to the silence of the night, realizing that the silence on the Deering must have been an absolute oppressive thing, heavier than the tons of coal below deck. A silence so profound it felt like a presence itself. You're seeing the fog, the ship, the shouting stranger, and the broken radio wire. 3 small errors, 3 moments of bad luck, combining to create one immense, perfect mystery. The only thing missing, you think, is a punchline. But this story doesn't offer one. It just ends abruptly and leaves you standing on a quiet, foggy deck with a sense of immense, unanswerable dread. Finally, what do you call a fake noodle? An impasta. I told you they weren't getting better. That's the feeling we're chasing, the dull, persistent sense that something is just slightly off-kilter, like a bad joke that never quite lands but instead just lingers. The narrative shifts now from the ghost of the voyage to the concrete, undeniable reality of the discovery. You are standing on the beach at Cape Hatteras, or perhaps you're the Coast Guard official on a small patrol boat, cutting through the chop towards the looming abandoned structure. The day is January 31, 1921. The scene is dramatic. The Deering is stuck, perfectly framed against the churning gray background of the Atlantic, her 5 masts standing sentinel against a sky that looks like wet slate. The ship is aground, tilted slightly to the side, wedged deep into the sand of Diamond Shoals. This area, as you now know, is so dangerous that hundreds of ships have met their end here, hence the name Graveyard of the Atlantic. But those ships usually meet their end violently, torn apart by storms, stove in by collisions, or simply swallowed by the shifting sands. The Deering, however, looks merely parked. The initial attempts to reach the schooner are hampered by the relentless surf and the sheer danger of the shoals. For 4 days, the ship sits there, a perfect, unnerving spectacle, tantalizingly close and yet unreachable. You feel the delay, the 4 days of watching this perfectly good ship mock rescue, and the anxiety of the onshore observers must have been palpable. Every sailor knows that time is the enemy at sea, and every hour the ship sat untouched meant the puzzle pieces were washing further out to sea. Finally, the weather breaks just enough for a detailed inspection. The Coast Guard cutter Seminole and the naval vessel USS Dale approach. It is an act of high risk just to get close. And then the first official steps are taken onto the empty deck. You are with them now. You step across the gunwale and feel the absolute silence of the deck. No creaking of men's boots, no murmur of conversation, no purposeful movement, just a groan of the rigging and the sound of the sea. The description of the scene found aboard is what truly defines the horror of the Deering. This wasn't a ship damaged in a storm where the crew abandoned it for safety. This was a place of sudden, immediate, and inexplicable evacuation. Mainstream scary fact time. Have you heard of the Screaming Skull of Bettiscombe Manor? This is a popular piece of English folklore about a skull that, if moved from the manor, would cause the entire estate, and sometimes the surrounding village, to be plagued by dreadful noises, screams, and terrible misfortune, including crop failure and death. The skull is believed to belong to a slave or sometimes a servant whose dying wish was to remain in the house. This story mirrors the Deering's lingering presence. The ship itself becomes the cursed object, demanding to stay where it is, punishing anyone who tries to rationalize its loss. You walk with the investigators into the heart of the ship. The first things they notice are signs of life interrupted, not concluded. The galley is open with food preparations visible. Perhaps not a full meal, but enough to show the routine was ongoing moments before the event. There are items left behind in the crew's quarters. Personal effects, pipes, tobacco, boots, clothing, nothing stolen, nothing smashed. It's as if the crew simply ceased to exist while standing still. This utter stillness brings us to the obscurity and fringe horror tidbit of the section, the fear of the sea's embrace. Many old salts believed the ocean had a personality, a vast, patient entity that only rarely chose to show its hand. The deep water, the cold, the abyssal pressure. It wasn't just a physical environment, it was a hungry consciousness. In the Outer Banks lore, there is a specific superstition that the sea sometimes grants a reprieve to the ship itself, but demands the life of every person aboard as payment, taking them quickly and cleanly so the vessel can be preserved as a warning. The Deering feels like a trophy in that dark tradition. And here's a third darkly humorous joke to cut the tension. A skeleton walks into a saloon and says, "Give me a beer and a mop." Maybe the crew was just very, very tidy about their vanishing act. The conditions of the ship present a logical conundrum that makes the mind reel. Here's your scholarly debate phrasing. Historians still argue whether the apparent lack of damage and the general orderliness of the deck, with ropes coiled and sails partially set, suggests a non-violent controlled evacuation, or if the order was merely coincidental, preserved by the swiftness of the event that took the crew. It's the difference between walking off a boat and being sucked off by an invisible force. You feel the cold metal of the door as you step into what must be the captain's cabin. Everything is in place, neat and organized. But there's a vital, chilling omission we'll cover in the next section. For now, you just register the emptiness of the space. It's a space that was recently occupied by a living, breathing authority figure, now just a box of wood and brass. The image is so perfect, so complete in its lack, that it's almost a piece of conceptual art, the ship as negative space. It forces you to consider what could possibly be so terrifying that 11 experienced men would step off a perfectly good ship into a stormy Atlantic, without sending a single word of warning, without grabbing their savings, without finishing their soup. You try one more piece of dark humor. Why did the ghoul cross the road to get to the other hide? On the Deering, the crew didn't even bother to cross, they just dissolved into the atmosphere. The eerie silence of the deck continues to press on you. No matter how many times you tell yourself it's just wood, metal, and water, you can't shake the feeling that the ship is watching you, patiently waiting for you to complete the pattern, to disappear, just like all the others. The ship, stuck fast in the sand, is waiting for the next human to mistake its intact state for safety. You realize that you have now lingered on the deck for too long. The cold seeps into your bones, and the silence seems to grow louder, amplifying the quiet beat of your own heart. It's time to move toward the cabin, and the details that make this mystery truly maddening. The patrolmen who finally boarded the Carol A. Deering weren't just stepping onto an abandoned vessel. They were stepping into a moment frozen in time, a tableau of domesticity interrupted by the unknown. You're now inside the ship, the light dim and dusty, filtering through the small portholes. The air is cold, damp, and carries the faint, lingering smell of coal dust, salt, and something metallic, perhaps fear or just old machinery. The Coast Guard survey team, led by Warrant Officer G.H. Henderson, quickly noted the two major immediate findings that separated the Deering from a simple storm casualty. First, the ship was entirely stripped of its personnel. Second, and crucially, the state of the living quarters suggested an evacuation that was either extremely rapid or highly controlled and organized, but definitely not panicked. You find yourself standing in the galley, the heart of the ship, which must have been the last truly populated space. You notice the evidence, the ship's large dining table. On it, they found remnants of a meal, not a feast, but enough to show that the crew was in the midst of routine. Dishes were set, though likely scattered by the subsequent days of rocking on the shoals. Most chillingly, several investigators reported that food was laid out, not fully prepared, but ready, as though the cook was just about to dish up when the event occurred. It's the small, intimate details that twist the knife. The crew's personal effects in their bunks, boots neatly tucked away, pipes resting on small shelves, an extra change of clothes hanging ready. These men were clearly planning to return. You don't leave your favorite pipe and your necessary walking boots if you're swimming for shore. You take things of value or things you need to survive. They took neither. This perfectly sets the stage for our obscurity and fringe horror tidbit, the silence of the seven whistlers. This is a particularly chilling bit of English and North Atlantic superstition. The seven whistlers are a spectral flock of birds, or sometimes disembodied human voices heard high overhead. Hearing them, especially at sea, is believed to be an absolute harbinger of disaster, a pre-death warning that signals a sudden, catastrophic loss of life. If the crew of the Deering heard the seven whistlers, they might have instantly known that they were marked for death, and perhaps, in a moment of communal dread, chose to take their own fate in their hands rather than wait for the inevitable unknown terror signaled by the whistling. The ship itself seems to refute the idea of a struggle. Mainstream scary fact, you might recall the famous murder case of the 18th century pirate ship, the Whydah, or rather the ship that was sunk and discovered later. That wreck told a clear story of piracy, storm, and violence. It was chaos frozen in time. The Deering, by contrast, shows no signs of violent entry, no blood, no shattered glass, no sign of a struggle in the crew quarters. It's perfectly clean, a horror story written in negative space. And you realize the depth of the puzzle. If they were kidnapped, why wasn't the ship ransacked for its valuable cargo or the crew's personal savings? If they abandoned ship in a panic, why were the personal items left, and why no SOS? Let's deploy a joke to momentarily disrupt the eerie atmosphere. Why did the skeleton refuse to go skydiving? He didn't have the guts. The crew of the Deering certainly lacked the guts to face whatever was happening, but they also lacked the sense to grab their cash. The only things immediately noticed as missing, beyond the crew, were two small items of vital importance: the ship's logbook and the two lifeboats. The presence of the lifeboats is a detail we will dissect later, but the missing logbook is particularly important. A ship's log contains all the daily entries: the weather, the coordinates, the interactions, the mood of the crew, and any events that occurred. Its absence creates a terrifying void. This absence brings us to the core of a scholarly debate, phrasing. Historians still argue whether the removal of the ship's logbook suggests deliberate destruction of evidence by the crew to conceal their actions, perhaps a planned mutiny or embezzlement, or if the third-party pirates or saboteurs removed it to ensure the mystery of the disappearance remained unsolved. It is the key to whether the horror came from within the ship or from without. You try another piece of dry, unsettling wit. What do you call a person with no body and no nose? Nobody knows. And truly nobody knows what happened to the 11 men, and the missing logbook is the ultimate symbol of that ignorance. You walk toward the navigation area now. You expect to find charts scattered, compass spinning wildly, some indication of a last-ditch effort to save the vessel. Instead, you find relative order. The navigation equipment is still in place, but perhaps untouched in the crucial final moments. The ship was running aground on a straight course, indicating that the person at the helm simply wasn't correcting the course to avoid the shoal. It suggests the man at the wheel, if there was one, was either incapacitated or was intentionally guiding the ship to its resting place. The overall feeling is one of profound, cold indifference. The ship doesn't care that its inhabitants are gone. It merely continues to exist, a floating museum of a moment that cannot be explained. You feel a sudden sharp urge to get off the vessel, to step away from the physical evidence of the unsolved, but the cold damp air keeps you rooted. You have to know what was in the captain's quarters. The fact that the crew left behind their most cherished personal items, photos, letters, personal money, is a detail that defeats almost every criminal explanation. No pirate would leave such easy pickings. No panicked crew would remember to leave their tobacco but forget to send a radio message. It forces you to look beyond the rational, beyond the human, towards something vast and inhuman in its methods. And one final joke for this leg of the journey. Why don't vampires need to pay attention? Because they already count Dracula. The Deering's crew, unfortunately, paid attention right up until the point they couldn't anymore, and now we're left counting the terrifying void they left behind. You've moved past the galley and the neatly made bunks, the physical presence of the absent crew becoming almost deafening in the silence. Now, you stand in the captain's quarters, the largest and most authoritative space on the ship. Captain Wormel's cabin, like the rest of the Deering, is orderly. But here, the omissions are not just baffling, they are screams disguised as silences. We've already noted the missing ship's log, a daily record that would have been kept meticulously by a man like Captain Wormel. It's an irreplaceable document containing the soul of the voyage. The logbook stand, or desk, is empty. It's not just lost, it was clearly removed, deliberately. But there are two other, equally chilling absences discovered by Warrant Officer Henderson's survey team. First, the ship's two chronometers, the highly accurate clocks essential for celestial navigation, were missing. And second, the crew's navigational charts, normally stored in a specific flat file cabinet, were also absent. Think about what this means. This isn't just a crew abandoning a vessel. This is someone stripping the vessel of the very tools needed to sail. If the crew evacuated in the lifeboats, why would they take the heavy, bulky, and delicate chronometers? And why would they take the current charts if they were simply trying to reach the nearest shore? You don't need the chart for the middle of the ocean when you are focused on landing on the nearest piece of land. It's a purposeful act that makes no sense in the context of survival. This calculated, confusing theft perfectly illustrates our mainstream scary fact, the methodical nature of some historical serial killers. Think of the Zodiac Killer or Jack the Ripper. Their terror wasn't just in the act of violence, but in the deliberate, calculated steps they took before and after. The ciphers, the missing organs, the taunting letters. The Deering's mystery mirrors this. The crime is the absence, and the theft of the logbook and chronometers is the killer's cold, calculated signature, left not to explain, but to deepen the dread. Let's try a bit of dark wit to ward off the growing sense of panic. What do you call a paranoid ghost? A believer. You're starting to believe in the unimaginable yourself, aren't you? The final, and perhaps most unnerving, detail in the captain's quarters was the unsaid watch. The ship's clock was still keeping time, but the captain's personal pocket watch, which he would have consulted constantly, was found on his desk, or perhaps tucked into a coat, but it was unset. For a methodical man like Wormel, this is akin to a sudden, fatal heart attack. It suggests he was interrupted in the middle of a simple, repetitive, personal routine. Here's your scholarly debate phrasing. Researchers disagree on whether the unset watch and missing navigational tools suggest a rapid, forced takeover by a foreign entity, perhaps Bolshevik agents or a piratical crew, or if Captain Wormel himself, under duress or delusion, ordered the ship to be stripped of its ability to navigate before abandoning it. It's the difference between a geopolitical conspiracy and a psychological breakdown at sea. You're seeing the scene now, the captain sitting at his desk, preparing his watch, the logbook open. And then, whatever happened, happens. It was fast enough to prevent him from taking the watch with him, but slow enough for someone to meticulously gather the chronometers and the chart. The timing is impossibly tight. This brings us to an obscure or fringe horror tidbit, the coastal superstition of the eerie double. Along the Outer Banks and among the old fishermen, there is a pervasive fear of seeing your own double on the water. This double is a reflection or illusion that appears when the fog is particularly thick and signals that your true self has already been claimed by the sea, and the physical you is only a temporary echo. If Captain Wormel saw his double, he may have realized his time was up and, in a moment of resigned horror, simply followed the invisible entity that was his destiny, leaving behind the tools of the world he was no longer a part of. The entire ship feels like a staged scene in a vast, silent play of horror. Who sets the stage so carefully? Who makes sure the audience, in this case, you, is left with only the most excruciating questions? Consider the sheer terror of having to abandon a ship that is still perfectly sound, not sinking, not on fire, and completely stocked with water and food. That terror must have been something so primal, so overwhelming, that survival instincts like grabbing money or food were overridden by the desperate need to simply escape the vessel. Let's try another bit of dark humor. Why did the cannibal break up with his girlfriend? Because she just wasn't his cup of tea. The crew of the Deering may have just found the ship itself not to their taste anymore. You feel the cold of the brass fixtures in the captain's quarters, the smooth, worn wood of his desk. You're touching the last physical connection to the crew, and all it gives you in return is a perfect, maddening lack of explanation. This is the heart of the Deering's terror, the refusal of the evidence to fit any understandable narrative. The sea has a secret, and the ship is its perfectly preserved vault. As you step out of the cabin, the silence follows you, a heavy, suffocating blanket of the unknown. You can't help but look over your shoulder, checking the empty doorway one last time. You've explored the ship's interior, felt the chill of the abandoned quarters, and registered the maddening contradiction of the missing logbook and the left-behind savings. Now we confront the immediate, desperate need to rationalize this impossible event. When the Deering was found, authorities and the public immediately grasped at the most rational explanations: mutiny, piracy, or a catastrophic natural event. The theory of mutiny was the first and perhaps most compelling idea. Captain Wormel was known to be firm, perhaps overly rigid, and his crew, a collection of disparate men, might have chafed under his authority. The tale from the Frying Pan Shoals lightship of an unauthorized, tall, thin man shouting the message about lost anchors lends credence to this. Perhaps the crew had already seized control, confined the captain, and were attempting to navigate the ship themselves when they ran into the shoals. If it was a mutiny, the crew would have stripped the logbook to hide evidence of the takeover and taken the chronometers and charts to continue their journey somewhere else. But this is where the theory hits a snag. Why abandon the ship in the shoals, a place notoriously difficult to salvage, when they could have simply sailed to a neutral port? And why leave behind their personal money and possessions? Mutineers are usually pragmatic criminals, not fastidious minimalists. The second primary theory was piracy, an event that was, surprisingly, still a real threat in the waters around the Caribbean and the Outer Banks, even in the 1920s. Mainstream scary fact. The infamous case of Blackbeard Edward Teach, though generations earlier, is a constant specter in the Outer Banks. He often preyed on ships along the Carolina coast, sinking them or taking them and their crews hostage. The fear of piracy was ingrained in the local community. If pirates boarded the Deering, they would have killed the crew and taken the valuables. But the ship's valuable coal cargo was untouched, the personal savings were untouched, and there were no signs of violence or struggle. Pirates don't simply remove the logbook and chronometers, they smash things, take what they want, and leave a mess. The Deering was too clean, too organized for a violent encounter. Here's your first slice of dark humor for this section. I tried to tell a joke to the sea, but it was a bit too deep. Deering's mystery is deep, but it's the quiet, unnerving kind of depth. The third, slightly more plausible theory was a sudden, violent storm that forced a rapid, catastrophic abandonment. The area is known for its sudden squalls. However, the weather reports from the days leading up to the grounding show nothing that would classify as a life-threatening, ship-breaking storm. The Deering was built to handle far worse. This set of contradictions leads to a satisfyingly frustrating scholarly debate. Phrasing: researchers disagree on whether the ship's abandonment was the result of a coordinated, premeditated criminal act involving smuggling or sabotage, or if the crew, terrified by an unknown phenomenon such as a rogue wave or massive sea creature, departed in haste, only for their lifeboats to be lost shortly after. It's the difference between a human conspiracy and nature's quiet cruelty. You feel the inadequacy of these human explanations. They all fall apart when faced with the hard, cold evidence of what was left behind. It's too neat for mutiny, too organized for a storm, and too pristine for pirates. Let's dip into our obscure or fringe horror tidbit, the North Atlantic doldrum siren song. A lesser-known piece of lore speaks of a sound, a low-frequency hum that sailors sometimes hear when traversing the calm, unsettling parts of the North Atlantic. It's said to be the siren song of the deep, which doesn't lure ships to crash, but lures the men to jump overboard by filling them with a sudden, overwhelming, and shared auditory hallucination of perfect peace or terrifying noise, making the ocean seem preferable to the ship. The entire crew might have experienced a shared psychosis, causing them to calmly, collectively step off the boat. You imagine the 11 men suddenly deciding in unison that the ship was the wrong place to be. They are climbing into the lifeboats, their faces calm, their movements purposeful, leaving their boots and their money steered by a sound only they could hear. Now, another darkly humorous moment. Why did the undertaker quit his job? He didn't have enough grave concern. The Deering's crew showed no concern at all for their earthly possessions, which is perhaps the most concerning detail of all. The investigation, frustrated by the lack of clear signs, eventually concluded that the crew had indeed left via the lifeboats. The reasoning was weak, based solely on the fact that the lifeboats were missing, and ignoring all the contradictory evidence. The Navy and the Coast Guard eventually decided to blow up the ship on March 4, 1921, to prevent it from becoming a hazard to navigation, a practical solution that destroyed the crime scene. A terrible, ironic end for a ship that had guarded its secret so well. You feel the frustration of the investigators, the pressure to close the case, and the ultimate act of destruction, destroying the only witness to the event. The mystery of the Deering was not solved. It was simply buried under tons of seawater and the bureaucratic desire for closure. And finally, the last joke before we descend into the uncanny details. What's a vampire's favorite ship? The casket boat. The Deering was empty. It was a ghost ship of the sea, sailing silently into the dark history of the North Atlantic. You can still hear the phantom whispers of the rational explanations trying to hold the story together, but you know they are all too thin, too human, to contain the horror of the impossible. You are back inside the hull of the Deering, having dismissed the inadequate theories of mutiny and piracy. The evidence is simply too subtle, too neatly arranged to be the result of a human struggle. Your focus now narrows onto the small, quiet details that speak volumes, specifically the galley and the captain's quarters. Let's linger on that unfinished meal in the galley. It's a small snapshot of normality. Imagine a single serving bowl, perhaps holding stew or salted beef, ready to be distributed. The preparation was ongoing. The cook, a man named Henry, was a routine-driven individual. He would not have left the meal mid-prep for anything less than an immediate, life-threatening emergency. Yet, if the emergency was so dire, why no radio call, and why the orderly abandonment of the ship itself? The fact that the meal was interrupted, combined with the unset pocket watch on Captain Warmel's desk, suggests a synchronous event. Whatever happened, it happened to all 11 men at the same time, hitting the authority figure at his routine task and the cook at his. A synchronized, universal pause. And now for the mainstream scary fact, the suddenness of the events on the USS Cyclops. The Cyclops, a U.S. Navy carrier ship, disappeared without a trace in March 1918, carrying over 300 men in the same general area of the Atlantic as the Deering. No distress signal was ever received. The sudden loss of the Cyclops, a massive state-of-the-art vessel, demonstrated that the ocean could and would simply absorb a fully manned vessel in a moment, leaving no trace. The Deering is the opposite. The ship was left, but the crew vanished just as completely and silently. You are now stepping into Captain Warmel's personal space again. Aside from the missing chronometer's log and charts, the investigators noted the absence of the captain's personal papers, specifically his financial records and his personal diary. While he left his wallet with money, he took his ledger of the voyage and his thoughts. This is a crucial distinction. The crew left their private cash, but the captain took his private records. This brings us to the obscurity or fringe horror tidbit, the mariner's fear of the ship mine. This is a deep, old superstition that a ship, after decades at sea, develops a malignant sentience, a consciousness that eventually begins to view its crew as parasites. The ship, tiring of the human presence, may decide to expel them without violence, creating a shared, irresistible mental compulsion to leave. The Deering, after years of service, may have simply decided it wanted to be alone, preserving itself in perfect, cold isolation, driving its crew to jump, not in panic, but in robotic obedience to the vessel's will. You can almost hear the ship whispering, "You must leave now. I need silence." 1. The paradox of the captain taking his diary but leaving his money leads to the scholarly debate, phrasing, researchers disagree on whether the selective removal of the captain's personal and navigational records indicates a deliberate attempt to conceal the destination of the lifeboats, or if the captain was forced to abandon his ship and took only those documents that proved his identity and command, knowing he might have to account for the abandoned ship later. It's the difference between a planned defection and a desperate attempt to maintain integrity. Let's introduce some dry wit to the scene. I accidentally swallowed some invisibility potion. I'm waiting for the results, and frankly, I can't see myself getting any better. The crew of the Deering achieved a similar permanent invisibility, and we can't see them anywhere either. Consider the layout again. In the crew's quarters, everything was neat. In the captain's quarters, the main tools of his trade are gone. It's not a looting, it's a surgical removal of the ship's ability to function as a controlled vessel. Whoever took the log and the chronometers knew exactly what they were doing and what to take to make the ship utterly useless for subsequent navigation. You think about the man at the lightship, the one who wasn't Captain Warmel. Was that man the leader of a mutiny? Was he the last survivor frantically trying to warn the world? The fact that he was tall and thin and spoke of lost anchors remains one of the few solid pieces of human interaction in the final hours, and it only serves to cloud the issue further. Another dark joke, just to keep the uneasy rhythm going. I just wrote a song about a tortilla. Actually, it's more of a rap. The Deering story is a rap too, a package of unanswered questions tied up with a tight nautical knot. The final image of the ship's interior is one of unsettling domesticity, a place prepared for habitation but utterly rejected by the inhabitants. It's the realization that sometimes the greatest terror is not the violent intrusion, but the quiet, final decision to opt out of reality, leaving your entire world behind as if it never mattered. The ship sits, waiting, and you realize you have absorbed its emptiness, the same silence the ocean demanded from its crew. You begin to feel the deck swaying beneath your feet, a gentle, hypnotic motion that seems to encourage you to lie down, close your eyes, and join the great silent sleep that claimed everyone else. One last piece of gallows humor. Did you hear about the new restaurant on the moon? Great food, no atmosphere. The Deering has great structure, no crew, and a terrifying atmosphere. You should probably step outside now. You've exhausted the rational human explanations. Mutiny, piracy, sudden squalls. None of them fully account for the ship's pristine condition, the abandoned cache, the unset watch, or the selectively stolen navigational tools. The mundane theories fail, forcing you and the original investigators to dip into the dark, cold depths of the paranormal. The sea, you realize, is not just a body of water. It's a collector of strange, impossible debts. The sheer inexplicability of the Deering case forces us to consider supernatural explanations, starting with the area itself. Diamond Shoals, the graveyard of the Atlantic, is a place where the veil between worlds seems particularly thin. It's the perfect staging ground for a vast, silent, inhuman occurrence. Think of the vast number of unsolved disappearances at sea. This is a mainstream scary fact. The Bermuda Triangle, though a relatively modern term, represents the collective, ancient fear of maritime voids. The area where the Deering was found, while north of the traditional Bermuda Triangle, shares the unsettling quality of being a region where ships and planes disappear without a trace, often in clear weather. Deering is essentially a grounded Bermuda Triangle mystery, a solid artifact left behind in a region that prefers absolute erasure. The question then becomes, what kind of entity takes the crew but leaves the ship and its possessions? It points away from a physical creature and towards something that operates on a different, possibly magnetic or psychic plane. The concept of the sea as a conscious, hungry entity leads us to an obscure or fringe horror tidbit, the myth of the deep-sea siren's tax. Unlike the classical siren who lured sailors to crash, this dark version of the legend suggests a vast collective intelligence in the abyss that occasionally demands a tax for safe passage. This tax is not gold or cargo, but the sheer presence of human life. It pulls the consciousness, the soul of the crew into the depths, leaving the body behind, or in the case of the Deering, simply pulling the physical bodies off the boat without disturbing the environment around them. The crew was literally consumed by the spirit of the deep. Let's lighten the mood with a touch of dark humor. Why was the ghost feeling down? Because he lost his spirit. The Deering's crew lost their spirit, their bodies, and their logbook. Talk about a bad day at sea. You imagine the moment of the tax being collected, a blinding light, a shared moment of absolute terror, a sound only they could hear, and then the invisible hand of the ocean pulling them into the lifeboats and away into the vast, indifferent darkness. This turn toward the supernatural allows us to frame the scholarly debate phrasing. Researchers disagree on whether the Deering's mystery can be attributed to rare, undocumented natural phenomena, such as concentrated methane gas eruptions or unknown magnetic vortices that could induce instantaneous crew incapacitation, or if the lack of evidence points definitively toward a supernatural explanation like an interdimensional rift or a focused entity of maritime folklore. It's the argument between rogue science and ancient superstition. You feel the cold air around you, realizing that the most terrifying thing about the ocean is its sheer indifference to human life. It doesn't hate you, it just doesn't care if you live or die. The details of the missing log and chronometer suddenly take on a new, darker meaning in this context. Perhaps the entity that took the crew was methodical, not because it was a criminal, but because it needed to erase the record of the encounter. It took the memory of the event, the log, and a means to locate the ship, the chronometers and charts, leaving behind a perfect, unlocatable mystery. Here's another dry joke for you. Why did the zombie only eat the brains of old people? Because he liked things pre-digested. The Deering's crew were clearly pre-digested by the sea's immense appetite for mystery. The very concept of a ghost ship is rooted in this failure of the rational. It is a ship that denies the laws of abandonment. If the ship is fine, the crew should be there. If the crew is gone, the ship should be wrecked. The Deering refuses this binary, existing as a floating contradiction, a persistent physical middle finger to logic. You are drawn back to the detail of the man at the lightship, the one who wasn't the captain. Could he have been a stowaway? A malevolent passenger who surfaced at the end of the voyage, demanding the ship be sailed into the shoals? Or was he merely the first manifestation of the sea's growing psychological pressure, a man driven mad by the ship mind or the siren's tax? Consider the final piece of dark humor. I saw a shirt that said, "Where there's a will, there's a way." Turns out the guy wearing it was a professional pallbearer. The Deering is a pallbearer for its own crew, silently carrying their absence to the shore. The ship is a canvas of quiet horror, where the brushstrokes are the missing items and the untouched belongings. You can almost hear the low, throbbing sound of the sea dregs collecting around the hull, patiently waiting for the next sailor or the next listener to join the chorus of the permanently lost. You are starting to feel the tug of that mystery, the desire to find the answer so strong it feels like a physical pull toward the empty deck. But you know that the answer, if it exists, is far colder and more ancient than any crime. You are now looking at a map of the North Atlantic, and the cold reality of the Deering's location sinks in. While the Carol A. Deering was found off the coast of North Carolina, the mystery of its disappearance is subtly, chillingly linked to the general area of other impossible nautical losses. We're talking about the extended reach of the inexplicable, the zones where physics seems to occasionally take a holiday. The Deering's final resting place is just north of what is sometimes referred to as the secondary triangle, a cluster of baffling disappearances that stretch up the eastern seaboard. This subtle geographic link is critical because it moves the focus away from the unique circumstances of Captain Wormel's command and toward a localized environmental phenomenon. Mainstream scary fact, the theory of infrasound at sea. This theory posits that certain weather conditions or underwater seismic activity can produce extremely low-frequency sound waves, infrasound, that are inaudible to the human ear but can induce feelings of panic, distress, vertigo, and extreme nausea. Infrasound at high intensity can even cause organ failure. If a burst of infrasound hit the Deering, it could have incapacitated the entire crew instantaneously, causing them to collapse or, in a moment of sheer irrational panic, jump overboard to escape the silent, vibrating terror. The fact that the ship was found perfectly sailing only to run aground suggests the crew may have been hit by an invisible wave of panic while the vessel was still under sail. They weren't sunk, they were simply cleared. This brings us to a crucial element in the whole terrifying puzzle, which is why the scholarly debate phrasing is so important here. Researchers disagree on whether the Deering's intact state, with the lifeboats missing, suggests a shared sudden psychological compulsion to abandon the ship due to a perceived threat, or if the evacuation was forced and controlled by an external human threat, which then vanished without a trace, leaving the ship to drift. It's the difference between mass hysteria and perfectly executed kidnapping. Let's introduce an obscure or fringe horror tidbit: the coastal fear of manned lifeboat disappearances. While the loss of a vessel is common, there's a lesser-known but more terrifying superstition in the fishing communities of the North Atlantic that a successful evacuation into a lifeboat does not guarantee safety. Certain zones are said to have an active ability to snatch lifeboats. These small vessels, full of hope, are suddenly capsized or pulled under by calm waters, a final, cruel joke played on the men who thought they had escaped the greater danger. The Deering's missing lifeboats may have been victims of this localized, malicious phenomenon. You realize the utter hopelessness of surviving the ship only to be claimed by the smaller boat. It's a double betrayal. Time for a touch of dry wit. My date with a ghost went terribly. She was all right, but she had no body. The Deering's lifeboats, too, left the ship with all of the body, only to end up with no body again. The investigators initially tried to link the Deering case with the disappearance of other vessels in the area, looking for patterns that might suggest a German U-boat or a smuggling operation. But the sheer volume of maritime loss in the graveyard of the Atlantic makes it difficult to distinguish an anomaly from the background noise of tragedy. The Deering is the loudest whisper in a storm of silence. You look at the empty wheel, the last man standing at the helm having simply walked away from his duty. You can imagine the sails catching the wind, the ship continuing its northward trek, guided by inertia and the great, patient currents, until it finally ran itself into the sandy embrace of the shoals. Here's another attempt at dark humor. What do you call a very tired sea monster? Exhausted. The Deering's crew must have been exhausted to the point of giving up their entire existence. The beauty of the Deering mystery and the source of its terror is that every rational piece of evidence, the unsaid meal, the abandoned clothes, the lack of distress, points directly to the irrational. You are left with a chilling conviction that whatever happened on board was an event so far outside the realm of human experience that all the men could do was comply with the command to leave. One final piece of morbid wit to close out the section. What's the difference between a fisherman and a lazy banker? One gets paid for what he catches, the other for what he drops. The Deering's crew dropped everything, and they certainly didn't get paid. The ship sits there, a permanent fixture on the landscape of the impossible. You feel the gravity of the ocean, the weight of all the lost souls, and the overwhelming realization that sometimes the greatest terror is not the sudden destruction, but the slow, agonizing, perfectly inexplicable absence. And you are now carrying that absence with you. You stand on the silent deck of the Carol A. Deering, and the cold, damp air seems to be echoing a far older tragedy. The story of the Deering is, in many ways, an echo chamber for the most famous ghost ship of all time. We must, at this point, draw a direct parallel to the Mary Celeste. The Mary Celeste was discovered in 1872, almost 50 years before the Deering, sailing near the Azores. Like the Deering, she was intact, perfectly seaworthy, and completely devoid of crew. Food was on the table, the captain's log was up to date with the final entry being unremarkable, and the cargo of alcohol was undisturbed. The only major difference was a missing lifeboat and a cut rope. Mainstream scary fact: the baffling case of the Mary Celeste has generated more theories, from sea monsters and giant squid to vaporized alcohol fumes and mutiny, than almost any other nautical mystery. The sheer impossibility of a fully provisioned functional ship being voluntarily abandoned by a competent crew is the core of the terror. The Deering repeats this impossibility with a terrifying consistency, almost as if it's a required ritual of the sea. You realize that the Deering takes the horror of the Mary Celeste and makes it worse. The Mary Celeste had a logbook right up to the end. The Deering's logbook was selectively stolen. The Mary Celeste was a beautiful mystery. The Deering is a cold, calculated crime scene with no criminal. This unsettling repetition leads us directly to the scholarly debate phrasing. Historians still argue whether the similarities between the Mary Celeste and the Carol A. Deering suggest a repeatable, undocumented natural phenomenon specific to the Atlantic, such as a large rogue wave or a magnetic anomaly, or if the identical nature of their abandonment points to a unique, recurring external intervention, perhaps criminal or even paranormal. It's the question of whether this is physics or patient, waiting malevolence. Let's introduce a piece of dry humor to the narrative. I saw a commercial for an invisible watch. I don't have time for that. The crew of the Deering ran out of time entirely and left their watches behind as a cruel irony. The obscurity or fringe horror tidbit for this section focuses on the psychological dimension of this recurring absence, the mariner's fear of the liminal ship. Sailors often spoke of certain ships that, due to their construction or history, existed in a liminal space, halfway between the living world and the realm of the lost. These ships, it was believed, would occasionally cross over, briefly becoming completely undetectable to the living world, and when they reappeared, the crew would be gone, having been transported or simply evaporated in the crossing. The Deering, like the Mary Celeste, may have simply blinked out of existence for a crucial moment, and when it came back, only the wood remained. You can picture the crew, moments after the ship has crossed back, looking around at the perfectly ordinary deck, and realizing with a silent horror that they are now the ghosts. Consider the implications of the abandoned money. In the early 20th century, cash and personal savings were often the most valuable things a sailor owned. To leave it behind means that the impetus for leaving was immediate, absolute, and had nothing to do with monetary gain. They were trying to escape something far worse than poverty. Here's another attempt at gallows humor. Why do ghosts love elevators? Because they lift their spirits. The Deering's crew had their spirits lifted right out of the vessel. The investigation into the Deering became tangled with the sheer volume of disappearances in 1921, with the tail end of a massive shipping boom, and vessels were disappearing at an unsettling rate. The authorities eventually tried to link the Deering to a possible Soviet or Russian involvement, suggesting the crew was involved in an attempt to smuggle goods or even people, but the lack of any supporting evidence meant this theory, like all the others, faded into the fog. You realize the profound terror of the ghost ship. It's a perfect machine that refuses to acknowledge the existence of the human soul. It exists in isolation, a testament to the sea's ultimate ability to take what it wants, while leaving the material shell intact. The Deering is a promise written in wood and canvas. You can be here one moment and gone the next, without a fire, without a storm, without a trace. You try to conjure one last dark joke. What do you call a ship that likes to sing? A sea shanty. The Deering sings only the song of silence, a note so chilling it vibrates in your bones. You're alone with that song now. The ship is gone now, blown up by the Navy to clear the navigational hazard, but the specter of the Deering remains lodged in the consciousness of the Outer Banks communities. The fishermen and the lighthouse keepers, those who truly know the temperament of the graveyard of the Atlantic, offered up far more unsettling explanations than the official inquiries. You are listening now to the old folk tales, stories passed down in low whispers over kerosene lamps and strong coffee. Among these tales, there is a specific, chilling account from an area known as the Outer Banks. It concerns a lone, unnamed lighthouse keeper, a man who dedicated his life to watching the impossible chaos of the shoals who claimed to have seen the crew. Mainstream scary fact, the haunting of the Great Lakes is Edmund Fitzgerald. While far from the Atlantic, the tale of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which sank suddenly in a 1975 storm, becoming one of the most famous maritime tragedies, is always invoked when discussing a ship that goes down without a word. The mystery surrounding the Fitzgerald's sudden demise, no SOS, just silence, is what fuels the ghost stories of the Great Lakes. The Deering is the Atlantic's version, a perfectly intact shell, only deepening the unsettling silence. The lighthouse keeper claimed to have seen the ship, yes, but also what he called the shadows of the crews in the days following the grounding before the weather allowed the Coast Guard to board. He said he saw the 11 men, sometimes on deck, sometimes by the rails, performing their duties. They weren't solid, they were like heat haze or a shimmering distortion in the periphery. This brings us to the obscurity or fringe horror tidbit, the doppelganger crew phenomenon. This is a rare maritime superstition where, after a crew has died violently or been taken by a supernatural force, their residual emotional energy or their shadow selves remains tethered to the ship for a short period. This crew of ghosts would endlessly repeat the final mundane tasks they were performing before the event. The lighthouse keeper's claim suggests the Deering's crew hadn't simply vanished. They were trapped in a loop, forced to continue their journey on a ship that was now only a monument to their absence. You picture the cook, Henry, endlessly miming the stirring of the stew, the captain standing rigidly at the empty wheel making phantom corrections to the course. It's a far more tragic image than a sudden, clean death. The keeper, terrified, claimed the shadows never looked at him, never acknowledged the light, but simply moved with a silent, purposeful dread until, one morning, they were gone, just before the official survey team arrived. It's as if the ship's internal drama was only visible to those who had been staring into the abyss for too long. Here's your dry, unsettling joke. I asked the ghost what he was doing on my ship. He said, "I'm just passing through." The Deering's crew are permanently passing through. This idea of residual haunting complicates the rational theories further, which is where we bring in the scholarly debate phrasing. Researchers disagree on whether eyewitness accounts of paranormal phenomena, like the lighthouse keeper's shadows, should be completely dismissed as anecdotal evidence and hallucination, or if such consistent, localized folklore points to a verifiable, though currently unexplainable, energetic distortion present in the Diamond Shoals area. It's the battle between objective reality and the terrifying truth of subjective experience. You try to put yourself in the keeper's shoes, watching the impossible. Day after day, a ship that should be empty seems to be going through the motions of life, a play without actors. Another morbid piece of wit. Why did the vampire open a fast food restaurant? He wanted to start a subculture. The Deering is a subculture of the sea, where life and death are served up cold and unexplained. The disappearance of the crew's personal papers, the captain's diary and ledger, also takes on a different meaning in this context. If the crew was taken by a force that left their shadows behind, maybe the only things they had time to save were the intangible records of their existence, the memory of who they were, leaving the money and boots as anchors to a reality they no longer occupied. You feel the cold, lonely dedication of the lighthouse keeper, a man who saw too much and was forever changed by the silent parade of the phantom crew. The terror of the Deering is contagious, a psychic infection that lingers in the fog. One final dark joke. Why did the invisible man turn down the job offer? He couldn't see himself doing it. The Deering's crew couldn't see themselves staying on the ship, so they made themselves invisible forever. You were left staring into the deep dark, knowing that the greatest witnesses to the horror are always the ones the official records forget. You've accepted the unsettling reality that the Deering's crew did not vanish randomly. They left. The physical evidence demands it. This brings us to the single most critical, tangible detail of the abandonment, the missing emergency rafts or lifeboats. 2 lifeboats were stored aboard the Deering. Both were gone. This fact was the primary reason the official inquiry ruled out a total, instantaneous loss due to a magnetic vortex or giant wave. If the lifeboats were missing, the crew must have taken them. However, here's the crucial, perplexing detail that was highlighted in the official report. The lifeboats may have been deployed in a non-emergency situation. The crew would not have used the large, seaworthy lifeboats just to travel a short distance to the shore, as the seas around the shoals were too rough. They were designed for long-term survival in the open sea. This is where the mainstream scary fact comes into play, the use of lifeboats in the final panicked hours of the Titanic. The Titanic had insufficient lifeboats, and the abandonment was chaotic, hurried, and terrifying. People grabbed whatever they could. The Deering's crew, with their ample lifeboats, appears to have executed a deliberate, organized departure, completely contradicting the need for panic. They left a perfectly good ship for a tiny raft in the deadliest stretch of water on the coast. The core question remains, why? The lifeboats are designed for escape from sinking. The Deering wasn't sinking, it was simply stuck. This paradox forces the scholarly debate, phrasing, researchers disagree on whether the deployment of the lifeboats indicates the crew was fleeing an internal threat, such as a contagious, rapidly debilitating illness or a psychotic episode of one of the officers, or if they were driven off by an environmental threat, such as an overwhelming swarm of noxious, poisonous gas from the cargo or the water, which required immediate, organized abandonment. It's the difference between self-inflicted terror and external chemical poisoning. You think of the men calmly climbing into the lifeboats, their faces perhaps covered against an invisible, choking vapor, carrying only the absolute essentials, the logbook, the chronometers, the captain's diary, and then rowing away into the cold Atlantic. The obscurity or fringe horror tidbit here is a dark one, the ship that sinks only its crew. Old sailors' lore speaks of a specific type of haunted vessel, usually one built on a cursed or ancient burial ground that periodically sheds its crew. It is a ship that sinks its people, not its structure. The ship remains afloat forever, but the men are condemned to drown one crew at a time simply because the ship demands human sacrifice to maintain its buoyancy. The lifeboats are then taken as bait for the next unfortunate crew. Let's introduce a piece of dry humor here. Why did the lighthouse keeper get a divorce? He needed time alone to reflect. The crew of the Deering is now reflecting in the vast emptiness of the ocean. If they did abandon ship in the lifeboats, what became of them? The search for the missing crew in the lifeboats was intense but fruitless. No bodies, no debris, no wreckage from the boats was ever found. They disappeared as completely as if they had never existed. This suggests that whatever took the crew took the entire footprint of their escape as well. It's a chilling double disappearance. You imagine the lifeboats rowing out into the open sea, and then a sudden, swift, silent moment where the boats are sucked under or capsized, leaving no trace. The terror of escaping only to meet a far more final, immediate end is almost unbearable. Here's another attempt at gallows humor. What do you call a very good sailor? Shipshape. The Deering was shipshape, but its crew was definitely not. The missing lifeboats are the final piece of the puzzle that proves that the crew chose to leave the ship. But the absolute vanishing of the lifeboats proves that the sea chose to take the crew and obliterate the record of their escape. The ship was left as a silent, mocking testament to their failure. The narrative returns to the physical emptiness of the Deering. You are standing near where the lifeboats would have been secured. The space is now vacant, the ropes cut cleanly. It wasn't a panicked slash, it was a deliberate detachment. Everything about the Deering's abandonment screams of a calm, controlled exodus into a terrifying unknown. And you are left to wonder if the men, as they rowed away, knew they were rowing toward an even colder, deeper silence. One final piece of dark wit. Why don't skeletons fight each other? They don't have the stomach for it. The crew of the Deering didn't have the stomach for whatever they were running from. We've established the contradiction. The crew left in lifeboats, but they left behind everything that would sustain them. You are now circling back to the crew's personal effects, the most human, heartbreaking details of this inhuman mystery. In the small, cramped crew quarters, the Coast Guard found all the men's cash savings. Small amounts perhaps, but significant for a sailor of the 1920s. Tobacco, pipes, favorite tools, letters from home. All the small talismans that anchor a person to reality were left untouched. Mainstream scary fact, the infamous case of Amelia Earhart's disappearance. The absolute mystery of Earhart's plane and crew vanishing over the Pacific in 1937 is terrifying because of the sheer scale of the search versus the total lack of results. Nothing was recovered. Like Earhart's plane, the Deering crew and their lifeboats disappeared without leaving any debris field. The ocean is perfectly capable of consuming every last shred of evidence, leaving nothing behind but an unanswered question. You try to imagine the mental state of the crew. If they were running from pirates, they would grab their money. If they were fleeing a gas leak, they would grab warm clothes. They did neither. They took the captain's diary and the ship's log, documents of record, and left everything of comfort and value. This suggests that their overriding motivation was not survival, but a complete and total escape from the ship, regardless of consequence. The focus was on leaving, not on living afterward. The obscurity or fringe horror tidbit here is found in the deep psychology of fear, the lure of the void. This isn't a monster, but a mental state. Sometimes, deep-sea solitude and the vast, dark emptiness of the horizon can induce a form of acedia, a spiritual weariness or profound despair that manifests as a desire to merge with the emptiness. The crew, perhaps already psychologically brittle from the long journey, succumbed to a shared, instantaneous belief that the only peace was in the water, a fatalistic compulsion to join the quiet sleep of the sea. You imagine the crew seeing the dark, swirling water and feeling, not terror, but a soothing, absolute relief. This is where the scholarly debate phrasing cuts through the psychological horror. Researchers disagree on whether the crew's choice to leave money and clothing indicates a completely sudden, forced departure that precluded any form of personal preparation, or if it reflects an ordered, non-panic evacuation where the crew knew they were going to a place where material possessions held no value. It's the difference between a lightning-fast emergency and a cold, metaphysical realization. Let's insert a little dark humor. Why are graveyards so noisy? Because of all the coffin. The Deering's deck is perfectly quiet, a coffin without a body. The act of leaving the money behind is the ultimate symbol of the Deering mystery. It's an abdication of the world of commerce, of human necessity. It is the final, undeniable proof that whatever the men saw, it was so far beyond the scope of their ordinary lives that money, life, and personal comforts simply ceased to matter. You were standing by one of the empty bunks, noticing a small, inexpensive tobacco pipe. It's a simple object, a comfort, a part of the man, yet it was left. You feel the weight of that pipe, heavier than all the unanswered questions. Another attempt at dry wit. What's a demon's favorite toy? A pterodactyl. The terror of the Deering is less flashy, more insidious, like a slow-moving, quiet storm. The silence of the ship is now the central character. The 5 masts, once carrying the crew across the vastness, now stand as 5 silent fingers pointing toward the impossibility of the event. The ship is a perfect, enduring memorial to the ultimate choice, escape over existence. The investigators tried to frame the case as a routine abandonment, but the abandoned possessions contradicted the narrative of survival. No one trying to survive leaves their means of trade and their personal documentation. The Deering crew was not trying to survive. They were trying to depart from a perceived horror. Final dart joke for this section. I told my friend a joke about the sea, but it wasn't salty enough. The Deering story is salty enough to preserve its terror for a century. You feel the sting of that salt now, mixed with the cold, damp air of the empty vessel. The evidence is all laid out, the orderly ship, the missing log and chronometers, the absent lifeboats, and the abandoned personal effects. You have chased the rational, the geopolitical, and the supernatural. Now, you observe the end of the official story, the final investigation, and the cold, bureaucratic closure of the case. In June 1921, after months of fruitless searching for the crew or the lifeboats, the official inquiry delivered its report. The findings were, perhaps inevitably, inconclusive, a frustrating blend of conjecture and documented facts. The committee cited the odd interaction at the Frying Pan Shoals lightship, the tall, thin non-captain, as proof of possible internal struggle or mutiny. They cited the missing lifeboats as proof of a successful, if doomed, abandonment. Mainstream scary fact, the infamous Black Dahlia case. The horror of the Black Dahlia murder isn't just the crime itself, but the way the case became a permanent, unsolved fixture in the public imagination, creating endless speculation and theories. The Deering mirrors this. The official report closed the file, but the public consciousness refused to let the mystery go. The closure only cemented the horror. The official conclusion, a kind of bureaucratic shrug, essentially stated that the crew probably abandoned the ship and the lifeboats due to unknown distress, and the lifeboats were subsequently lost at sea. It was a failure to commit to a theory, masking an absolute failure to understand the event. They dismissed the oddities, such as the abandoned money and the selective theft, as irrelevant or unprovable. This brings us to the core of the scholarly debate phrasing. Historians still argue whether the government's decision to close the Deering investigation without a definitive finding was a justified conclusion based on the total lack of physical evidence, or if it represents a deliberate suppression of a potentially embarrassing discovery such as the involvement of organized crime, foreign agents, or an unexplainable military incident that would have revealed national security weaknesses. It's the difference between simple incompetence and cold-blooded cover-up. You feel the weight of that paper closure. The case is filed away, the ship is destroyed, and the sea returns to its indifferent, vast silence. The obscurity or fringe horror tidbit here is the terrifying realization that the sea will not give up its dead or its secrets. In ancient sea lore, the ocean is personified as a jealous god that actively conceals its victims. If the sea decides you are gone, you are gone. It works to prevent the return of the body, the wreckage, or the truth. The Deering is a perfect example. The ship was allowed to return as a taunt, but the crew and the record of their leaving were successfully absorbed into the dark waters. Let's try a bit of dry wit. What do you call a priest who becomes a lawyer, a father-in-law? The authorities tried to be both a priest and a lawyer to the Deering mystery, and failed at both. The greatest terror is that the crew may have been victims of a perfect storm of unrelated events, a psychological breakdown of the captain leading to the log's removal, a sudden debilitating illness that caused abandonment, and then a localized squall that capsized the lifeboats. 3 rational, tragic events combining to create a single, irrational, perfect mystery. You consider the fate of Captain Wormel's family and the families of the other 10 men. They were left with nothing but an empty ship and an inconclusive report. No bodies to mourn, no definitive answer to lay to rest the gnawing question of how and why. The uncertainty itself becomes the ultimate weapon of the horror. Another attempt at gallows humor. My friend got fired from his job at the cemetery. Apparently, he was burying people on the wrong side of the grave. The Deering was found on the right side of the shoals, but its crew ended up on the wrong side of existence. The silence of the Atlantic is the final crushing answer. The ocean is not bound by human logic, by police reports, or by the need for closure. It simply takes. And the Carol A. Deering, the ship that came home without its people, remains one of the greatest, coldest secrets it has ever kept. You are now standing on the shore, watching the spot where the ship was finally exploded, the water calm now, the sandbars having successfully performed their final duty. One last dark joke. What's a ghost's favorite food? Boo berries. The Deering has left us with nothing but booze and lingering dread. You've traced the history of the Carol A. Deering from its last ordinary contact to its chilling, empty arrival, through the frustrating investigation, and finally to its destruction. You've let the cold reality of the sea's indifference and the human failure to explain the inexplicable settle over you. Now the narrative turns inward, reminding you that the mystery isn't just a historical footnote. It is something you have allowed to permeate your own quiet, sleeping space. You are no longer observing the ghost ship. You are experiencing its echo. The stillness of the Deering's deck is now the silence of your room. The only sound is the persistent low hum, perhaps the fan, perhaps the wind, or perhaps the faint psychic echo of the North Atlantic doldrum siren song you learned about earlier. The unsettling questions that plagued the ocean, where did they go, why was it so sudden, are now pressing against your own consciousness. You realize the ultimate horror is that if a perfectly good ship can be emptied of all life without a struggle, a trace, or a sound, then the space you occupy is just as fragile, just as susceptible to the absolute, sudden vacuum of the inexplicable. Mainstream scary fact, the terror of spontaneous human combustion. This is a concept often debated, where a human body is said to ignite without external sources, rapidly turning to ash. It represents the ultimate, inexplicable, immediate removal of a person from existence. The Deering's crew were victims of a maritime version of this, a spontaneous, total removal from the vessel, leaving behind only the perfect, terrifying emptiness. The key to the Deering mystery was its completeness. The absence was total. No body, no wreckage, no final word. This brings us to the final, necessary piece of the puzzle, and the scholarly debate phrasing. Researchers disagree on whether the total disappearance of the crew and lifeboats points to a highly localized, natural event that consumed all organic matter, or if the sheer efficiency of the vanishing suggests an intelligence, human or non-human, that meticulously cleaned up every shred of evidence. It's the difference between physics and design. You are now imagining your own room as the Deering's cabin, your phone, your keys, your water glass. These are your personal effects. Would you take them if you had to leave immediately? The Deering's crew left their money and took the captain's ledger. It was a choice rooted in a final, terrifying clarity. This leads to the final obscurity or fringe horror tidbit, the coastal fear of the ship wipe. This is a theory whispered among the older sailors that some ghost ships are not haunted by the dead, but are actively used by an entity that requires them to be completely sterile. This entity periodically wipes the ship clean, removing the current crew and all traces of them, before sending the ship on its way to lure the next batch of unsuspecting victims. The Deering was not a tomb, it was a trap. Let's include the last darkly humorous joke. What do you call a sleeping bull, a bulldozer? You are now asleep and you are being bulldozed by these cold, lingering thoughts. The greatest fear, you realize, is not the storm or the monster, but the silent, cold conviction that the world or the sea can simply decide you are no longer necessary and remove you with the terrifying efficiency of the Carol A. Deering's final voyage. You are left alone with the sound of the rain, the hum of the air, and the absolute knowledge that everything you own, everything you are, can be left behind without a second thought. The final piece of dark wit. Why don't vampires like to be caught in the rain? Because it dampens their spirits. The crew of the Deering had their spirits dampened, drowned, and then permanently erased. The story ends not with a conclusion, but with a question delivered into the quiet space you now inhabit. Did the Deering's crew step willingly into the lifeboats, or were they pushed by a logic so alien, so powerful, that their 11 lives were less important than the neatness of the mystery? The wood of the ship is gone, but the emptiness remains, and it is now entirely yours. Now, the story is over. You can let the tension go. You can let your shoulders soften, and your breath deepen, slowing down. The rough texture of the history fades now, replaced by the soft, comforting sound of the ambient noise, the rain, the fan, the distant, muffled sounds of the world still turning outside your window. The chill that you felt from the sea, the damp, cold sense of the Deering's empty deck, that is just a memory now. It's only a story, a whisper passed through the wires, a phantom from a century ago. The sailors are long gone, their ships are dust, and the ocean has swallowed the last lingering questions. You don't need to try and solve it anymore. The greatest maritime minds couldn't figure it out, so why should you, here, tucked in safe and warm? The mystery is what it is, a beautiful, cold contradiction. A testament to the fact that sometimes the most profound peace is found not in having answers, but in accepting the quiet, absolute indifference of the world. Let the image of the 5 masts fade. Let the chill of the captain's unset watch dissipate from your mind. There is only the gentle, rhythmic motion of your own breathing now, a reliable, steady anchor in the vast, quiet night. The sea is far away. The shoals are safe beneath a century of waves. You are here, and you are whole. Feel the pillow beneath your head, soft and familiar. The darkness in your room is just darkness. It is not the bottom of the Atlantic. The sounds you hear are just the settling of your own home, making those small, inevitable, comforting creaks and murmurs. The ship is gone. The shadows of the crew have dispersed. Everything is quiet. Just sleep. Let the quiet take you now, pull you under into the deep, dark calm of rest. There is nothing left to fear tonight but the dreams you bring with you, just the soft, quiet rhythm of your breath, and the silence. End of script. Sleep, if you can.